Picture an ancient European landscape, ice-capped mountains claw to gray, unforgiving sky. In this world, a figure moves through the frozen tundra. Strong, resilient, with a shock of red hair standing out against the snow. For generations, we have held this image close. The idea that this fiery trait, so rare in the modern world, is a direct inheritance, a genetic echo from our archaic cousins, the Neanderthals. It's a powerful narrative. It connects those with red hair today to a deep, primal past, a lineage of survival. And it seems plausible. After all, according to geneticists at Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, most modern humans of non-African descent carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. It is a known fact, codified in our very cells. So, the story writes itself. Neanderthals evolved red hair as an adaptation to the low light of Ice Age Europe, and when our Homo sapiens ancestors arrived, they interbred, passing the trait into our lineage. It's a clean, linear story of inheritance. But what if that story, as compelling as it is only a fragment of a much larger, more complex tapestry? We see the Neanderthal as this archetypal figure. They are often portrayed as a kind of anti-hero in the human origin story. Brutish, yet intelligent. A failed branch of the family tree, yet one whose blood still flows in our veins. This romantic vision makes the inheritance of their most distinctive trait feel almost poetic. It's a story we want to be true. But in science, what we want to be true is often the first casualty of evidence. You might find yourself thinking that the genetic link is obvious. Where else would such a distinct trait come from, appearing so prominently in the very lands the Neanderthals once dominated? For decades, this assumption went largely unchallenged. It became a piece of accepted pop science wisdom, repeated in documentaries and articles, a settled question. But the history of science is a history of settled questions being torn open by a single inconvenient discovery. An anomaly that refuses to fit the paradigm. The question of Neanderthal red hair was for a long time purely theoretical. There was no way to prove it. Not until we developed the technology to read the genetic code of the long dead. The gene responsible for red hair in modern humans is well understood. It is called the melanocortin-1 receptor, or MC1R. It acts as a switch, controlling the type of melanin our bodies produce. A specific set of mutations in this gene results in the production of the reddish pigment pheomelanin instead of the darker eumelanin. The logic was simple. Find a Neanderthal specimen, sequence its MC1R gene, and look for the same mutations. If the mutations matched, the case would be closed. The narrative of inheritance would be confirmed, written into the bedrock of scientific fact. But what if they didn't match? What would that imply? For years, the challenge was finding a Neanderthal fossil with enough preserved DNA to even attempt such a delicate analysis. Ancient DNA is notoriously fragmented, broken down by time and bacteria. It is like trying to reassemble a shredded manuscript left in the rain for 40,000 years. But in northern Spain, in a deep cave system known as El Sidrón, archaeologists unearthed something extraordinary. The remains of at least 12 Neanderthal individuals, their bones sealed in the cold, stable environment of the cave, offered an unprecedented opportunity. The conditions were so perfect that tiny fragments of their genetic code had survived the millennia. Here, in these bones, lay the potential to finally answer the question. A team of geneticists, led by Carl L.U.E.Z. Fox, undertook the painstaking task. They were looking for a key to unlock a piece of our identity, to confirm a cherished belief about our lineage. But what they found instead was an anomaly. A single, confounding result that would not only fail to confirm the story, it would set the stage for a complete paradigm shift in how we understand evolution itself. The El Sidrón cave system is a labyrinth of passages winding through the Spanish hillside. In a remote gallery, archaeologists found the bones. Not a ceremonial burial, but a tragedy. The evidence suggests a single family group. Victims of a cave collapse or perhaps cannibalism, their remains quickly buried and preserved. For paleoanthropologists, it was a genetic treasure chest, a snapshot of a Neanderthal family frozen in time, around 49,000 years ago. The focus of the 2007 study published in the journal Science was singular and precise, to extract and sequence the MC1R gene. This gene is the master controller of pigmentation. In the vast majority of humans, it functions perfectly, leading to brown or black hair. But in a tiny fraction of the population, it carries a loss-of-function mutation. How tiny? According to the National Geographic Society, less than 2% of the world's population has naturally red hair. That's approximately 150 million people. To put that number in perspective, it's equivalent to the entire population of Russia or of Bangladesh. Yet this population isn't concentrated. It's scattered, with the highest frequencies between 10 and 13% found in Scotland and Ireland. This geographical clustering in northwestern Europe, the last stronghold of the Neanderthals, is the very reason the connection seems so compelling. The scientific team knew exactly what they were looking for. In modern European populations, there are 3 main variants of the MC1R gene that account for the majority of red hair. These are well-documented mutations, specific changes in the genetic code that scientists can identify. The expectation was clear: if Neanderthals pass this trait to us, their MC1R gene should contain one of these same variants. The process is incredibly delicate. Drilling into the ancient bone, extracting powder, and isolating the degraded DNA fragments requires sterile, cleanroom conditions to avoid contamination from modern human DNA. It's a high-stakes, high-tech form of archaeology. The team successfully amplified the fragments of the MC1R gene from 2 of the Sidrón individuals. As the sequence data began to assemble on their computer screens, the first part of the hypothesis seemed correct. The Neanderthal MC1R gene showed a mutation. It was, indeed, a variant that would result in a loss of function, leading to the production of the red pigment, pheomelanin. This confirmed that at least some Neanderthals had the genetic potential for red hair and pale skin. The headline seemed ready to be written. But then came the unsettling discovery. The specific mutation they found, a variant now known as R307G, had never been seen before. They checked the databases of modern human genetics, extensive libraries containing the genomes of thousands of individuals from around the world. It wasn't there. They compared it to the known red hair variants in Europeans. It was not a match. This was the anomaly. The Neanderthals did have a red hair gene, but it was their own red hair gene. It was a completely different solution to the same biological outcome. Think of it as 2 engineers designing a bridge to cross the same river. One builds a suspension bridge, the other a truss bridge. Both serve the same function. But the blueprint itself is alien. The functional meaning, red hair, was there. But the code itself was different. This single piece of data created a profound problem for the simple inheritance model. If the trait was passed down through interbreeding, we should find the Neanderthal version of the gene in modern redheads. But according to the 1000 Genomes Project, it is completely absent. And likewise, the common modern human versions of the gene were absent in the Neanderthal specimen. The genetic bridge between them was missing. It was a shared trait from a separate path. The implications were immediate and paradigm-shattering. It suggested that red hair had evolved not once, but twice. It appeared independently in 2 different human species on the same continent, separated by tens of thousands of years of evolution. This was no longer a simple story of A gives to B. This was something far stranger. Of course, this was just one study from one location. Skepticism is the engine of science. Could the Sidrón individuals be an isolated case? A genetic fluke within a small inbred family group? Perhaps other Neanderthals in other parts of Europe carried the same variants we do. The possibility had to be considered. The jury was still out. The fair balance of evidence required more data. The 2007 paper was a bombshell, but it was not definitive proof. To truly unearth the answer, scientists would need to go from sequencing a single gene to sequencing an entire Neanderthal genome. They needed to move from a single sentence to the entire book of Neanderthal life. The discovery raised the stakes immensely. It was no longer just about hair color. It was about the very nature of our connection to our closest extinct relatives. The absence of that genetic link was a whisper of a much deeper truth about the way evolution works. A truth that suggests our own human story is not as unique as we might like to believe. The Sidrón anomaly was not the end of the investigation, but the beginning of a far greater one. The Sidrón results left the scientific community with a core, nuclear question. How could 2 separate human lineages, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, both develop the same rare physical trait from entirely different genetic mutations? The odds seem astronomical. It is like lightning striking the same place twice, but on different planets. This question forces us to step back and re-examine the forces that shape life. Everyone knows that evolution is driven by natural selection, but we often think of it as a meandering, random process. What the Neanderthal data suggested was something more deterministic. Hidden pressure, a powerful environmental force that could guide 2 separate evolutionary paths to the exact same destination. What could that force be? The answer lies in the geography. Both Neanderthals and early modern humans in Europe lived under the same weak sun, far from the equatorial latitudes where our species originated. Our African ancestors possessed dark skin, rich in eumelanin, as a natural sunblock against intense UV radiation. But as humans moved north, that strength became a weakness. According to research from Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, UV radiation is essential for the body to synthesize vitamin D, a critical component for bone health and immune function. In the low light, frequently overcast conditions of Ice Age Europe, dark skin would have blocked too much of the scarce UV light, leading to vitamin D deficiency. This would have had devastating health consequences, a condition we now know as rickets. Therefore, there was an intense selective pressure for lighter skin. Any mutation that reduced melanin production would have been a significant advantage, allowing more UV light to penetrate the skin and produce vital vitamin D. The MC1R gene is a primary target for such a mutation. A broken MC1R gene leads to less dark melanin and thus lighter skin. Red hair is simply a side effect of this process. So the why becomes clear. Both species needed a solution to the same environmental problem, but this only deepens the mystery of how. If the problem was the same and the genetic target, the MC1R gene, was the same, why weren't the solutions identical? Why would our lineage invent a new mutation when one presumably already existed in the Neanderthal population they encountered? To confirm this wasn't a fluke, the investigation had to go global. It required the combined efforts of the world's leading genetic institutions. They would need to unearth more Neanderthal DNA from more locations and piece together not just a gene but an entire genome. The answer lay waiting, codified in the fossil record. And what it would reveal was not an exception, but an undeniable rule. The next chapter in this investigation unfolds not in a Spanish cave, but in a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. At the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Svante Pääbo and his team were pioneering the field of paleogenomics. Their goal was audacious: to sequence the entire nuclear genome of a Neanderthal. This was not just looking for a single gene. It was an attempt to read the entire genetic blueprint, the scientific equivalent of the Apollo program. Their breakthrough came from a tiny finger bone found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The specimen, which came to be known as the Altai Neanderthal, had been preserved in the frigid conditions for over 50,000 years, yielding DNA of unprecedented quality. The full genome was published in the journal Nature in 2014. It was a landmark achievement, giving us a near-complete genetic tapestry of a Neanderthal individual. With this full genome in hand, researchers could now check the Sidrón finding against a completely independent and far more comprehensive dataset. They navigated to the location of the MC1R gene. The result was unequivocal. The Altai Neanderthal did not have the unique Sidrón mutation, nor did it have any of the common modern human red hair mutations. Its MC1R gene was, for all intents and purposes, normal. This might seem like a contradiction, but it was actually a crucial piece of the puzzle. It demonstrated that the Sidrón variant was likely a rare, localized mutation, not a universal Neanderthal trait. More importantly, as more Neanderthal genomes from different locations like Vindija Cave in Croatia were sequenced, a consistent pattern emerged. None of them possessed the MC1R variants common in modern humans. The anomaly was becoming a rule. The final nail in the coffin of the inheritance theory came from the other direction. Scientists scoured massive human genetic databases, projects like the 1000 Genomes Project, which contains data from thousands of people across the globe. They searched specifically for the Neanderthal R307G variant from Sidrón. The result was a deafening silence, 0 occurrences. Not a single modern human on record carries the Neanderthal red hair gene. The proof was now overwhelming. We have the symptoms of a profound evolutionary mystery. Symptom 1. Some Neanderthals had the genetic machinery for red hair. Symptom 2. Some modern humans have the genetic machinery for red hair. Symptom 3. The machinery is fundamentally different in its design. Symptom 4. There is 0 evidence of a transfer of this machinery between the two populations. A shared trait, a separate path. This is the essence of what we can label the ghost trait phenomenon. A trait appears in one lineage, seems to vanish with its extinction, only to reappear in a parallel lineage, as if by magic. It haunts the family tree, but its origins are separate. It is an illusion of inheritance, a trick of evolutionary light. When you realize the sheer improbability of this, the mind grasps for an explanation. The simple story we started with, a story of ancestry and inheritance, has been definitively disproven by the very data we hoped would confirm it. The link is not just broken. The evidence, codified in multiple genomes, shows it was never there to begin with. We are left standing before a conclusion that is nothing short of paradigm shifting. Red hair is not a Neanderthal gift. It is a human invention. Or rather, it is 2 separate inventions, conceived for the same purpose, by 2 different kinds of human. The implications of this are immense, forcing us to reevaluate the very nature of our lineage. This conclusion, however, leaves a vacuum. It demolishes a comfortable myth but does not yet provide a new framework. The evidence has shown us what happened, but it hasn't explained the underlying mechanism. If not inheritance, then what? What powerful unseen force in nature could compel evolution to write the same story twice, using a completely different language, and what does that force tell us about the nature of life itself? To understand the new paradigm, we must first unearth the origin of the old one. The myth of Neanderthal red hair was not a random fabrication. It is deeply rooted in our centuries-long quest to understand our place in the world and to define ourselves against, and in relation to, our ancient cousins. When the first Neanderthal skeletons were discovered in the 19th century, they were depicted as brutish, stooped, and ape-like. They were the evolutionary other, a failed experiment that served to highlight the inevitable triumph of Homo sapiens. But over the 20th century, a reassessment began. We found evidence of Neanderthal burials, of sophisticated tool use, and perhaps even symbolic thought. The caricature softened. They became less of a monster and more of a tragic hero, a sophisticated human lineage that simply lost the evolutionary game. It is in this context of rehabilitation that the idea of shared traits became so powerful. When we discovered in the early 21st century that we carry their DNA, it was a profound moment of connection. The Neanderthal was not just a cousin, but in a small way, an ancestor. We began to look for their legacy in ourselves. And what could be a more potent symbol than fiery red hair, a trait associated with the rugged, northern peoples who now inhabit the Neanderthals' old lands? This narrative offers a simple, powerful story of identity. It says, part of me is ancient, wild, and resilient. It's a compelling story to tell ourselves. The problem is that it prioritizes a satisfying narrative over the hard evidence. It's a form of modern myth-making. Now, let us set that myth aside and follow the origin story that is codified in the data, beginning with our own lineage. The story of Homo sapiens begins in Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors evolved under an equatorial sun. Our biology is fundamentally adapted to that environment. A key adaptation is skin-rich in eumelanin, which provides crucial protection from high levels of UV radiation. Then, according to the Smithsonian Institution, around 70,000 years ago, small groups of our ancestors began to migrate out of Africa and into Asia and Europe. When they arrived in Europe, they entered a world for which they were poorly adapted. It was a world of long, dark winters and a weak, seasonal sun. It was also a world already occupied. The Neanderthals had been living there for over 200,000 years. They were the true natives of Ice Age Europe, fully adapted to its rigors. For the newly arrived Homo sapiens, the lack of UV radiation posed an existential threat. As we discussed, vitamin D synthesis was severely hampered. The selective pressure was immense. Evolution is not a gentle guide, it is a brutal editor. Individuals whose bodies could not cope with the new environment would have had lower survival rates and fewer offspring. Any genetic mutation that offered even a slight advantage would have been rapidly favored. And so, within the European Homo sapiens population, mutations began to appear. These were random copying errors in the genetic code, as all mutations are. But some of these errors happen to occur in genes that control pigmentation, including the MC1R gene. One such mutation, for example, might have changed a single letter of the genetic code, rendering the MC1R receptor slightly less effective. The individual carrying this mutation would have had slightly lighter skin. In this new northern environment, this was a winning ticket. They could produce more vitamin D. They were healthier. They had more children who inherited the advantageous gene. Over thousands of years, what began as a random error spread through the population until it became common. Several different mutations in MC1R appeared and were selected for in the European population. The ones we see today, the R151C and R160W variants, for instance, are the descendants of those ancient successful mutations. They are the genetic record of our ancestors' struggle to adapt to a new world. Red hair was not the goal of this selection, it was a byproduct. The primary target was skin pigmentation. This is the origin story of red hair in our lineage. It is a classic tale of natural selection, a beautiful illustration of how populations adapt to new environments. It is our story. But what we must now understand is that it is not the only story. Tens of thousands of years before our ancestors ever faced the European winter, another lineage had already confronted the same challenge. The Neanderthal lineage had diverged from ours approximately 700,000 years ago. They had their own long, independent evolutionary history in Eurasia. They too descended from African ancestors with dark skin. And they too faced the same problem of low UV radiation. The same selective pressure that would later act on Homo sapiens was already at work on them for millennia. And their biology responded. Within the Neanderthal population, random mutations also occurred. One of them, the R307G variant we unearthed in the Sidrón bones, happened to strike their MC1R gene. It also created a loss-of-function receptor. It also resulted in lighter skin and, for those who carried two copies of the gene, red hair. It was an independent, parallel solution to the exact same environmental problem. When you lay these two origin stories side by side, the picture becomes clear. This is not a story of inheritance, it is a story of parallel evolution. Two different species, with a shared ancestral toolkit, faced with an identical problem, independently arrived at an almost identical solution. The Neanderthal lineage found its own answer to the darkness of the north, an answer written in a different genetic dialect. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met and interbred, there was a mixing of genes. We acquired Neanderthal DNA that influenced our immune systems and other traits. But by the time this happened, Homo sapiens in Europe were likely already well on their own evolutionary path toward lighter skin. The Neanderthal MC1R variants simply didn't offer a significant enough advantage over the homegrown human variants to be selected for and spread widely. They may have been lost to genetic drift, or perhaps they had other, slightly negative effects that we don't yet understand. Whatever the reason, the genetic record is clear. Their solution to the problem of low light died with them. Our solution is the one that survived. This truth is more complex, but also more profound than the simple myth. It doesn't give us a direct, romantic link to a fiery-haired Neanderthal ancestor. Instead, it reveals something deeper about the nature of life. It shows us that the paths of evolution are not as random as we think. There are patterns. There are preferred solutions. The environment itself acts as a sculptor, and sometimes it carves the same shape from different blocks of stone. We have now dismantled the myth and laid out the separate origin stories. But we are still left with the how. We need a name, a mechanism, for this startling phenomenon of parallel development. This is the hidden power we alluded to earlier, the force that creates these ghost traits. And understanding it will not only solve the riddle of red hair, but will also change the way you see the entire natural world. The phenomenon we have been tracing, this pattern we have labeled the ghost trait phenomenon, is not a fringe theory or an unsolved mystery. It is, in fact, one of the most fundamental and well-documented principles in evolutionary biology. The hidden power that drives it has a name, codified over a century ago: convergent evolution. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, convergent evolution is the process whereby organisms not closely related independently evolve similar traits as a result of having to adapt to similar environments or ecological niches. It is the ultimate testament to the power of natural selection as a creative problem-solving force. It demonstrates that for any given problem, there are often a limited number of optimal solutions, and evolution, through the random process of mutation and the non-random process of selection, will often find those solutions again and again. To truly grasp its power, we must look beyond the human story. The natural world is a gallery of its masterpieces. Consider the evolution of flight. The ability to fly has evolved independently at least 4 times in the history of life, in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Each of these lineages started from a non-flying ancestor. Each, through its own unique evolutionary path, transformed its appendages into wings. A bat's wing is a modification of a mammalian hand, with skin stretched between elongated fingers. A bird's wing is a modification of a reptilian arm, covered in specialized structures called feathers. An insect's wing is a completely different structure, an outgrowth of its exoskeleton. The underlying anatomy is entirely different, but the aerodynamic form, the aerofoil shape that generates lift, is remarkably similar. This is convergence. Different origins, same solution. Or consider the eye. The complex camera-like eye of a human and the camera-like eye of an octopus are stunningly similar in function and overall structure. They both have a lens, an iris, and a retina. For years, biologists thought they must share a common ancient origin. But genetic analysis, as detailed in studies from institutions like Stanford University, has proven they evolved completely independently. Our last common ancestor with an octopus was a simple worm-like creature that lived over 600 million years ago and had only the most basic light-sensing cells. From that simple starting point, our lineage and the cephalopod lineage, on entirely separate branches of the tree of life, both evolved a sophisticated camera eye because it is an incredibly effective solution to the problem of seeing the world. The physics of light dictates the optimal design and evolution, and 2 separate grand experiments arrived at it. Now, let us apply this powerful lens back to our own story. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are the 2 separate lineages. They are much more closely related than humans and octopuses, but their evolutionary paths had been separate for over 500,000 years. The shared environment was Ice Age Europe. The ecological problem was the lack of UV radiation and the need for vitamin D synthesis. The optimal solution was depigmentation, lighter skin. The most direct genetic pathway to this solution was to disrupt the function of the MC1R gene. Evolution, acting on the random mutations that arose in each population, found a way to do this in both. In the Neanderthal lineage, it selected for the R307G mutation. In the Homo sapiens lineage, it selected for a different set of mutations, like R151C. The outcome, pale skin and, in some cases, red hair, was the same. The trait converged. The popular myth of inheritance saw similarity and assumed a direct line of descent. The reality revealed by genetics is that we are looking at a remarkable case of convergent evolution within the human family itself. It is not ancestry, it is analogy. When you realize that this is the mechanism, the entire paradigm shifts. The Neanderthal is no longer just our ancestor. They become a parallel experiment in humanity. They are a testament to the fact that our evolutionary path is not the only one possible. Faced with the same challenges, another kind of human found another way to become, in this one small respect, just like us. This understanding elevates the story. It replaces a simple, almost trivial tale of inheritance with a narrative of profound depth. It speaks to the predictable, almost law-like nature of evolution under specific constraints. The environment of Ice Age Europe didn't just permit lighter skin, it demanded it. And the genomes of two different human species both answered the call. This principle also helps explain other aspects of the human tapestry. For example, light skin also evolved independently in East Asian populations, but through mutations in different genes altogether, such as OCA2. Once again, a similar environmental pressure, in this case, also related to northern latitudes, led to a convergent outcome through a different genetic pathway. So, the ghost trait phenomenon is unmasked. It is convergence, a fundamental force of evolution, playing out on the grand stage of natural history. The implications are far-reaching. It means that when we see a trait in an ancestral species that mirrors our own, we can no longer automatically assume direct inheritance. We must consider the possibility that we are looking at two independent inventions. This reframes our entire relationship with the fossil record. It forces us to be more rigorous, to question our assumptions, and to appreciate the complexity of the evolutionary process. The story of red hair becomes a cautionary tale against the allure of simple narratives. It is a perfect example of how the tools of historical genetics can unearth a truth that is more intricate, and ultimately more awe-inspiring than the myth it replaces. We have now revealed the hidden power. But this revelation does not close the book. Instead, it opens a new one, filled with even more complex questions. If our connection to our past is not as straightforward as we believed, what does this mean for our sense of identity? What is the agenda of the simplistic narratives we tell ourselves? And what do we lose when we let them go in favor of a more complicated truth? The conclusion that red hair in Neanderthals and humans is a product of convergent evolution has profound implications for how we construct our identity. For many, the idea of a Neanderthal heritage was a tangible link to a deep, almost mythical past. To learn that this specific visible trait is not part of that legacy can feel like a loss. It challenges a story that, for some, has become codified as a part of who they are. This brings us to the polemica at the heart of this investigation. The conflict between the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and the complex, often counterintuitive reality written in our DNA. The antagonist in this narrative is not a person or an institution, but a process, the oversimplification of science for popular consumption. This process isn't malicious. In fact, it often operates from a place of good intention. The goal is to make complex topics accessible and engaging. A story like You Get Your Red Hair from Neanderthals is easy to grasp, memorable, and exciting. It's a perfect piece of scientific trivia. It's a narrative that believes it is doing good by fostering interest in our shared past. This is the villain denial paradox. The most pervasive misinformation often comes from a genuine desire to educate and inspire. But the cost of this simplification is the truth itself. It flattens the rich, textured landscape of scientific discovery into a caricature. It trades profundity for palatability. And in doing so, it robs us of the chance to appreciate the far more magnificent story that the evidence actually tells. A story not of simple inheritance, but of parallel worlds and evolutionary echoes. The new understanding does not diminish our connection to Neanderthals. That 1% to 2% of our DNA, confirmed by institutions from the Max Planck Institute to Harvard, is real. It is a quantifiable, undeniable part of our lineage. It influences our health, our immune system, and other aspects of our biology in subtle but significant ways. Our connection is real, but it is a complex mosaic, not a simple checklist of traits we can point to in the mirror. You might find yourself thinking, what is the harm in the old story? The harm is that it builds our identity on a false foundation. It encourages us to see ancestry as a set of romantic, archetypal traits rather than the intricate, messy, and fascinating genetic tapestry it truly is. The real story, the story of convergence, offers a different, more powerful form of identity. It suggests that our humanity is not defined solely by our unique lineage, but also by the common challenges life presents and the similar ways different forms of intelligence evolved to meet them. It connects us to the Neanderthals not as a child to a parent, but as two engineers who, faced with the same environmental problem, independently drafted a similar, elegant solution. It is a relationship of mutual, albeit unknowing, respect across the millennia. We look at them across time, not as a reflection in a primitive mirror, but as the authors of a rival masterpiece. This paradigm shift forces us to ask new questions. If red hair is a convergent trait, what else might be? We know that adaptations to high altitudes have evolved independently in populations in the Andes, Tibet, and the Ethiopian highlands, all involving different genetic pathways. Each is a separate story of convergence, a testament to evolution finding different routes to the same summit. How many other human traits that we assume are part of a single linear story are in fact echoes of this same process? The investigation into Neanderthal genetics has opened a door to a new way of seeing human history. It is less a single mighty river of our own lineage and more a braided stream, with channels that diverge, run parallel, and sometimes, briefly, touch again. Our story is intertwined with that of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and likely other archaic humans we have yet to unearth. It is a story of shared problems and separate solutions. A shared trait, a separate path. The final truth is that science is a process of revealing ever deeper levels of complexity. It rarely provides simple, final answers. Instead, each discovery, each paradigm shift, reveals a new set of questions, each more profound than the last. We began with a simple question about hair color. We end with a fundamental inquiry into the nature of evolution and identity. Evidence is codified in our cells. The story of red hair is not one of simple inheritance, but of a shared challenge, met by parallel genius. It makes us question what other traits we assume are unique to our lineage might be echoes of solutions found by others. And it leaves us with a final, unsettling thought. If evolution can produce the same outcomes in different species, what does it truly mean to be human? If this investigation into our deep past has sparked your curiosity, subscribe for more explorations into the anomalies of human history. And in the comments below, let us know what other long-held beliefs about our origins you think deserve a closer look. The search for answers continues. We just saw our history is a braided stream, not a single river. So after seeing evolution solve the same problem twice, what other core human trait do you suspect isn't uniquely ours at all? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read and replied to every single one. But this parallel evolution is just the beginning. The next video reveals the genetic proof that their legacy isn't an echo. It's written inside almost all of us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the truth, like if you see the connection, and share this with someone who needs to know.